Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Nun lasst uns Gott dem Herrn, which translates to, Now let us to God, the Lord. This is a very straightforward chorale. We're just going to hop right into the analysis and talk about the handful of little harmonic quirks as we encounter them linearly. So, 1 sharp in the key signature, we start with G major, we end with G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major. We have a passing tone in the bass, more specifically a passing 7th, and then we go to E minor, E, B, E, and G. That's our submedian, or our 6. And then we have kind of an interesting progression. We have B, B, D, and F sharp. That's B minor in root position, which is our mediant. 3 typically goes to 6. 6 going to 3 is an example of what I've been calling a transitive progression, and it's kind of interesting just because of the fact that it is going against this sort of rule, I guess, of the idea that chords, or at least one of the paths of least resistance, is going down a descending fifth. Here we are going an ascending fifth, but if the voice leading can take the chord in one direction, why can't it go in the other direction? We have a passing 7th in the tenor, and then we have C, G, C, and E. That's C major in root position, which is our 4 chord. 3 going to 4 is a relatively normative progression, an adjacent harmonic progression. The numbers are next to one another in the scale. And then we have D and F sharp with G and C. That's not anything, just 2 passing tones in the outer voices. We then have E, G, B, and G. That's another E minor chord, which is 6. 4 going to 6 is kind of an interesting progression. And then we have some passing tones going on in the upper voices, E, G, C, and A. Does spell an A minor 7 over E chord, which is where we would expect 6 to go to, 6 going to 2. In this case it's 2, 4, 3, because the lowest note is the 5th of the chord. We then have D, G, D, and B. That's G major in 2nd inversion, so that's 1, 6, 4. One of the only times we typically see 2 going to 1 is when it's going to 1 in root position, because the 5th of the scale, the dominant of the scale, is on the bass, and typically 1, 6, 4 is paired with 5. The only other time we see 1, 6, 4 not going to 5 is if there's some type of intermediary chord, but 5 is typically the chord on the other end of it. This C is an accent, or it's not an accented non-chord tone, it's just a non-chord tone. I think it's called an escape tone when you skip into it, or step into it and then skip or leap out of it. But our 1, 6, 4 chord does go where we expect: D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord, our dominant, our first dominant, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes we use this bracket notation to show the relationship between 1, 6, 4, and 5. They often appear with one another. In fact, in most cases, they appear next to one another. This C is a delayed passing 7th, and then we have G major, ending our perfect authentic cadence, G, G, B, and G. 3 roots, 1 third. Alright, looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, so we're looking for a point on which we modulate, and I reckon it happens around the C sharp, so maybe the beat before. So we have another G major chord to start off the phrase. We have G, B, D, and G, so no need to reanalyze. Similar to how we started the chorale, actually the exact same chord with the exact same voicing. We have a passing 7th on the bass as well before we get E, B, E, and G. Things are looking very similar to how we started. This is a 6 chord, E minor, and I think this is where we modulate to the key of D. E minor also happens to be the supertonic in the key of in the key of D. We have a passing 7th on the bass before we go to C sharp, A, E, and A. That's A major in 1st inversion. We would expect 2 to go to 5, so that's a good sign that the modulation is occurring right here for analysis sake. We also have some passing tones or some non-chord tones happening in all of the voices, which signals to me that there is a subdivision of the harmonic rhythm going on right now. We have B, B, D, and G. That's G major in 1st inversion, which would be 4, 6. A bit of an unusual progression. Typically 4 goes to 5, but here we have 5 going to 4. It's not unprecedented by any means, but still a little unusual, because we, like I said, expect 4 to go to 5 because its function is typically predominant, not post-dominant. And then we have A sharp, C sharp, C sharp, and F sharp. That is F sharp major over A sharp, and this is clearly a secondary dominant chord. This would be the dominant of B, which in the key of D major is our 6th chord. So this would be 5, 6 of 6. And we would expect it after our passing 7th in the melody to resolve to B minor, which it does. B, F sharp, D, and D, which is B minor, our 6th chord. And we have a passing tone in the alto as well. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we have E, G, B, and G. That's E minor in root position. Kind of unusual to see a root position 2 chord here. Typically we expect inverted 2 chords, more specifically first inversion 2 chords, either 2, 6 or 2, 6, 5. But it's not, like I said, unprecedented. Just like how we have 5 going to 4 here, that's not unprecedented. It's just less typical than the variation that we usually see, which is 2, 6. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to analyze it. And then we have an atypical cadence here. This is an imperfect authentic cadence, so the formulas that we expect with a perfect authentic cadence don't typically appear. We get some wacky combinations, which I would classify this cadence as kind of a wacky combination because the bass is shared between the dominant and the predominant chord. We have E, A, C sharp, and G, and that spells A7 over E, which is 5, 4, 3. This is the second 4-3 chord that we've seen in the chorale, and the fact that the bass is just resolving down by step as well as the melody resolving down by step is kind of unusual from a contrapuntal standpoint. If you've taken a counterpoint class, you know that melodies in a contrapuntal texture typically resolve in opposite directions. You see typically the melody going up, or there's usually contrary motion between the outer voices, just like how you could see in the first. No, this is not contrary motion, but it's unlike motion in the sense that they're not moving. They're moving in the same direction, but they're not moving the same distance. That's not a good example for me to make that claim. But if you've taken counterpoint before, if you know anything about counterpoint, you know that the melody typically moves in a different direction than the other supporting voices. Nevertheless, we have 2 going to 5, 4, 3 here, which 2 going to 5 is what you would expect in a cadential situation. This G is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, which we typically would in a cadential situation. Bach often likes to include these passing 7ths or neighboring 7ths, whatever configuration you find them in. But still, 5, 4, 3 is kind of an unusual chord. We've seen them pop up recently, though, in different circumstances and cadences, but here we have it in kind of an unusual fashion. But the cadence ends on D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is an authentic cadence but imperfect because the tonic is not in the melody. Now looking ahead, we have another cadence that ends on D major, but this one I'm convinced is a half cadence, so it's interesting that there's the juxtaposition of a D major cadence here and a G major cadence, both that consist of D major as our final cadential chord. So we start off our phrase with B major, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is a secondary dominant. We've learned, have we seen it yet? No, we're going to see it again later, I believe, but B major is 5 of 2 in the key of D major. We have not yet modulated to the key of G major because this is a half cadence in the key of G major, but I'm convinced that at the beginning of this system we will have modulated. Even though we have C sharp, C sharps in proximity of the cadence, I think those are just tonicizing tones, not modulatory tones. But 5 of 2, we would expect this to go to 2 or E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our supertonic. It resolves where we would expect it to, and I think that we are using the 2 chord. We're using the same chord we got into D major with to get out of D major. So in the key of G major, E minor is our 6th chord. It's our submediate. We have a passing 7th as well. We see a very similar bass line happening as well here, however, except for instead of C sharp, we have C natural here. So we're seeing some similarity between this phrase and the previous phrase. We have C, C, E, and G. That's C major in root position, which is our 4 chord in the key of G major. And then we have a passing tone in the bass. And then we have A, C, E, and A. We might be tempted to call this a 2-chord. We have kind of a thirds progression here where the chords are a third apart diatonically. However, I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually an F-sharp diminished chord in first inversion, F-sharp, A, and C. Typically 4 going to 7 is a more likely progression. You could even say that this was a 2-7 progression, but I think if you watched my video yesterday, I talk at length about why I don't think 2 going to 7 is a very valid progression. I know the word valid is very weighted language, but nevertheless, I think in the context of predominant, dominant chord progressions, 2 going to 7 is the weakest, and I think that's matched and sort of verified by the fact that the progression is created only by one voice moving. For you to go from any other predominant to dominant chord, 2 or more voices have to move, or at least 2 voices have to move, which makes the progression feel more progressional, I guess, for lack of a better term. But yeah, 4 going to 7 is a much more likely progression, and I think that that's what's being inferred from, or conveyed from, what's going on in the chorale here. We would expect this to go to a tonic triad, which it does, G, D, G, and B, our tonic triad. This E is a non-chord tone before we get A, C sharp, G, and A. That's A7 over, that's actually just A7 in root position, which is 5-7 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, and D is our 5. This D is a non-chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone, and actually we kind of have a 1-6-4 chord here happening in the counterpoint, but I think because everything's happening over suspensions and there's just different rhythms going on, there's not as it's not as strong of a chord progression. I don't think that the chord progression is being subdivided, or the harmonic rhythm rather is being subdivided at this point because of all the counterpoint going on. It's the chord might be happening for a brief moment, but all the voices are doing their own thing, and I don't think that's as strong of an argument as other subdivisions of the harmonic rhythm, like this one, for example, feels where all the voices are in agreement. But yes, this C sharp is still a chord tone, this E is a chord tone, and then 5-7 of 5 eventually resolves to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. And one of the hints that typically points me in the direction of a half cadence being a half cadence is if the fifth of the chord is in the melody. Now this is not true of all half cadences. Some half cadences don't have the fifth of the chord in the melody, and some authentic cadences have the fifth of the chord in the melody. You just have to use your ear. But typically with half cadences, the melody ends on the fifth of the chord, and that has the tendency to want to resolve down by a step, which it doesn't. But if you were to redact the rest of the chorale and then ask yourself where that chord wants to resolve, or that line wants to resolve, generally I come to the conclusion that it wants to resolve down by step, and that's what my ear tells me. So that's the conclusion that I reach. We then have another B major chord, this time over D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is, in this case, not 5-6 of 2, but 5-6 of 6, because now E minor is our submediant, not our supertonic, because we're in G major, not in E minor. And before we get too far ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major to end our chorale. This A is a passing seventh, and we would expect to resolve to E minor, but we don't, and this is probably the most beautiful moment in the chorale from an analytical standpoint, and also I think sonically it's the most beautiful point in the chorale. We go to E, G, and E, which looks like an E minor triad, but we have a C in the melody. This is C major over E, or 4-6, and in terms of E minor, I'm not going to put the parenthetical analysis here because I don't think we're in the key of E minor. But this is in E minor's terms, and this brings me back all the way to, I think, the first video on the channel. This is a deceptive progression in terms of E minor, because if B was just 5, C major would be 6 in the key of E minor, and we know that 5 going to 6 is a deceptive progression, or at least one take on a deceptive progression, the way that the textbook would teach you. But I think we should broaden our terminology to include just chord progressions that just take you to unlikely places, right? Which is really what deception's about. But 5 going to 6 really does have that deceptive hallmark sound. So we have 4-6. We have some passing tones in the lower voices, and if we take all the notes on the that are occurring on this beat. We have F sharp, A, E, and C, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5 in root position, so 7 7. 4 wants to go to 7, and we would expect that to go to 1. 4 7 1's a very staple normative progression, so G, B, D, and B. Tonic triad, G major. Passing tones in the inner voices this time, kind of creating a C major 7 chord over G, but I don't really think it's contributing too much to the chord progression. Even though a 5 chord is on the other end of it, it feels like, I don't know, I just don't really hear it that way. But it is a normative chord progression. Maybe I will just write it just to be consistent, because I did the same with the 7 chord, might as well. Maybe, and there, I guess you could look at this also as some imitation between the two voices, where the lower voices get it and the inner voices get it, this rising stepwise motion. But 4 4 3, or C major 7 over G, goes to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. Even the 7th of the chord resolves down by step. I'll give it to Bach for that one, probably as a subdivision of the harmonic rhythm going on here. But this D major chord is our 5 chord. We have a passing 7th in the bass before we get to B, D, G, and B. It's G major in first inversion, so 5 going to 1 6. G is skipped 2 in the bass here, which is kind of like putting it in root position, but there is an escape tone C here in the melody at the same time, so kind of or derails the argument that there is a root position G major chord in following the 1 6 chord here. And as we close in on our cadence, we have D, D, G, and A. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and we know that a 5 chord's being implied here. This F sharp is our eventual destination when we get it for a longer note value here, but this E is an ornament, this A is a chord tone, this D is a chord tone, this F sharp is our chord tone, and this C is a passing tone before we cadence on G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad. Apologize for being a little scatterbrained. I think I'm coming down with something, and that is definitely hurting my focus. It hurt my focus all day, and I tried to shake it off, but I had to record the video for the daily upload quota that I am sticking to until I'm done with all of these chorales. Hopefully you're able to follow the analysis and I didn't ramble on for too long and not making sense while doing it, but I think I was able to hold my own, and I think the analysis came out somewhat clearly. But hopefully I could sleep it off and tomorrow's video will be a little bit clearer. But other than that, it's a very straightforward chorale, not too many difficult points. All of the chords are very clearly outlined, and progression wise there weren't too many loops that I was thrown for. So on that note, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and also hit the notification icon. You'll be notified of when my daily upload goes live, so you can get your daily fix of Bach and analysis in the same place. But other than that, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.